Catherine takes on the responsibilities for the Duchy of Kent.
This is a deep and private loss. All our thoughts are with her beloved family, our royal family, at this moment of profound grief. This is a deep and private loss for them.
The absence of Queen Camilla was explained as illness. The presence of Laura Lopes was explained as nothing at all. Yet both details collided like thunder inside Westminster Cathedral. A royal funeral should be about solemnity, devotion, and legacy. Instead, it opened with whispers of contradiction. On September 16, 2025, the royal family gathered beneath the high arches of Westminster Cathedral. They came to mourn Catherine Worley, the Duchess of Kent. Draped in black, they followed tradition with slow steps and hushed prayers. But as cameras scanned the pews, one sight was impossible to ignore. Camilla was not there. Her chair, expected to be near King Charles, remained empty. Palace officials said she suffered from sinusitis. Yet tabloids published photos of her at a lavish tea gathering with wealthy society wives only 2 days earlier. Glassware sparkled, laughter rose, preparations for a holiday abroad were whispered about. The contrast was stark, the optics devastating, and where the queen consort should have sat, her daughter appeared. Laura Lopes, Camilla's child from her first marriage, was seen slipping into the pews. She is not a royal by title, nor by blood. She carries no official duty, no position in the House of Windsor. Yet on this day of grief and tradition, she stood in the shadows of the royal procession. To many, it looked like an audacious attempt at symbolism, a daughter of Camilla occupying a place her mother had abandoned. Observers exchanged uneasy glances. Was this a misstep or a move? Was Laura there by chance, or was it a subtle signal? Royal analysts quickly filled the airwaves. Some suggested Camilla was maneuvering, trying to project her daughter as a princess in waiting, a figure woven into events where she did not belong. Others believed it was simply careless, a lapse of judgment at the worst possible moment. Either way, the narrative shifted before the first hymn was sung. The funeral of a duchess became the stage of a quiet scandal. King Charles walked in, his face grave but steady. Prince William followed, his hand close to Catherine's. Together they embodied composure. But all eyes drifted to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, dressed in a black tailored coat with pearls at her ears. She was not only mourning, she was waiting. The late Duchess Catherine Worley had made a final request before her passing. In her last months, she had spoken to her husband, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. She wanted Catherine to inherit responsibilities tied to the Kent legacy charities, patronages, and household oversight. She believed Catherine carried the same quiet devotion she had once lived by. At 92, the Duchess left this world with dignity. At 89, her husband remained to see her wishes fulfilled. And on this day of sorrow, Charles would make that wish reality. But before the announcement came, the cathedral's atmosphere brimmed with contrast. Gregorian chants echoed through the nave. Incense rose, thick and sacred. A coffin draped in cloth was carried in by pallbearers. King Charles stood as anchor of the monarchy. William stood as heir. Catherine walked beside him with calm assurance. Meanwhile, the ghost of Camilla's absence loomed. Her laughter at a tea party contrasted sharply with the mourning silence of Westminster. Her daughter's presence made the contrast louder. It looked less like illness, more like avoidance. Less like duty, more like choice. The cameras lingered. Reporters scribbled furiously. Laura Lopes, in simple black attire, bowed her head, yet the air felt uneasy. She was not in the house. She was not of the bloodline. Still, she sat where a queen should have been. This is how history twists, not with proclamations, but with empty chairs and unexpected faces. And so, the stage was set. Catherine would soon step forward. She would read from the scriptures, her voice steady and clear. She would console younger members of the family. She would embody both sorrow and strength. And at the height of the service, King Charles would rise. His voice would break through the incense. His words would confirm what insiders already suspected. The authority of the Kents, the charities, the duties, the legacy would pass into Catherine's hands. It was the Duchess of Kent's last wish. It was the Duke's quiet approval. It was Charles's chosen act of symbolism. But in the opening moments, the power shift was already visible. Catherine stood tall, serene, and unchallenged. Camilla was absent, Laura was misplaced, and the monarchy's future tilted toward a single figure. The funeral of Catherine Worley was meant to be an ending. Instead, it became a beginning, and everyone inside Westminster Cathedral knew it. To understand the weight of September 16th, one must first return to the life of Catherine Worley, the Duchess of Kent. Born in 1933, in Yorkshire, she carried the grace of the countryside into the corridors of royalty. Her upbringing at Hovingham Hall taught her discipline, faith, and a sense of duty. Yet she was not the type of woman who sought the spotlight. Instead, she chose education, standing in front of classrooms as a teacher in Kensington. It was unusual for a woman tied to aristocracy. Royal brides were expected to shine at galas and stand on balconies. Catherine chose chalk and textbooks. For her, service meant shaping the minds of children. It was a quiet rebellion wrapped in dignity. In 1961, her life shifted. She married Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. The wedding at York Minster was not a spectacle for headlines, but a union of tradition and warmth. From then on, Catherine became part of the Windsor fabric. But she never allowed herself to dissolve into the background noise of tiaras and titles. Her identity grew through causes, not ceremonies. She became patron of the Royal Opera House, lending her passion for music to institutions that needed her. She played the piano with precision and feeling, often for private charity recitals. She worked with UNICEF, visiting the vulnerable across continents, speaking less about royalty and more about responsibility. This is what defined her, substance over spectacle. But her life was not untouched by darkness. She spoke openly about her struggles with depression, a subject rarely acknowledged in royal circles. By breaking that silence, she offered dignity to those who suffered in private. She endured personal loss, including the stillbirth of a child and the devastating death of her son in 1994 to drug-related struggles. Each time, she emerged not harder, but softer, channeling her grief into compassion. Her choice to convert to Catholicism in 2019 deepened her independence. It was an act of faith, not strategy, and it set her apart even in her final years. She walked her own path, and in that, she earned quiet respect. It is within this life story that we find her bond with Catherine. The Princess of Wales represented what the Duchess admired: duty balanced with empathy. Both women carried themselves with quiet authority. Both chose causes over vanity. At Wimbledon, where Catherine once offered comfort to nervous athletes, Catherine later brought her same gentle touch to the players. At hospitals, charities, and schools, they mirrored one another, different generations, but the same spirit. In her last months, the Duchess spoke often of Catherine. Close aides revealed that she saw in Catherine a kindred soul. She confided in her husband, Prince Edward, that Catherine should be entrusted with Kent responsibilities. These were not ceremonial trinkets. They were patronages, household traditions, and charitable commitments that carried decades of history. Passing them required more than blood, it required trust. And so, she made her wish. By the time September arrived, her health had declined. She passed on September 4th, at age 92, surrounded by family at Kensington Palace. The palace's announcement on September 5th was simple, almost understated. Yet those who knew her understood the weight of what would follow. The preparations for her funeral reflected her life. No grand parades, no extravagant rituals. Instead, a Catholic requiem mass at Westminster Cathedral, the first of its kind for a senior royal in modern times. The decision honored her faith, even if it diverged from tradition. But alongside faith came politics. The absence of Camilla cast a shadow. Her official reason, sinusitis, was accepted on paper but doubted in whispers. The image of her sipping tea with socialites days earlier was too sharp to ignore. Meanwhile, Laura Lopes' presence stirred unease. It felt like an intrusion. It felt orchestrated. And in the silence of Westminster, this undercurrent clashed with the Duchess's intent. For the Duchess had made it clear, she wanted Catherine to carry her legacy, not outsiders seeking footholds. Prince Edward supported this choice. At 89, frailty marked his frame. His public appearances often showed him leaning on canes, his once vigorous military posture softened by age. Yet his voice on this matter was firm. He had stood by Catherine through 6 decades of marriage, through crises and triumphs, and he now stood by her final request. It was not about politics. It was about continuity. For Edward, handing Catherine a family brooch during the service would mean more than jewelry. It would mean a covenant, a symbol of trust passed across generations. This is why, on the morning of September 16th, the cathedral filled with tension. It was not just about grief, it was about inheritance of duty. Every hymn sung carried 2 layers: mourning for the Duchess and anticipation for Catherine. Every prayer whispered spoke not only of faith but of transition. The crowd did not know the exact moment, but they sensed it. Something would be announced, something would change. And Catherine herself seemed to sense it too. Dressed with quiet elegance, she walked with William at her side. She took her seat close to the front, her posture composed, her eyes calm, yet aware. When she rose to read from Corinthians, speaking of love and endurance, it was more than scripture, it was an alignment. Her words echoed the Duchess's life. Her tone carried the promise of what was to come. Inside the cathedral, history bent. Camilla's absence turned whispers into speculation. Laura's presence turned discomfort into distraction. And Catherine's voice turned mourning into preparation. The Duchess of Kent was gone, but her spirit, her ethos, her way of living royalty without arrogance, was alive in Catherine. The funeral was meant to close a chapter, yet it was already opening another. For when King Charles rose to speak, all doubt would end. Westminster Cathedral was a theater of silence. Incense curled upward, carrying centuries of ritual with it. Gregorian chants filled the vaulted space, voices steady, resonant, timeless. The coffin of Catherine Worley, the Duchess of Kent, rested at the center, draped in simple cloth. Candles flickered, casting long shadows against the marble pillars. Every element pointed toward reverence. Yet beneath the surface, another current flowed. The royal family sat in somber ranks. King Charles at the helm, his face solemn. Prince William beside Catherine, his composure unshaken. The Duke of Kent, frail yet upright, held his cane with both hands. His eyes betrayed exhaustion but also intent. He was not merely a mourner, he was a witness to a promise. Then, there was Laura Lopes. Her presence remained a riddle. Among royals defined by lineage, Laura's place felt foreign. She bowed her head at the hymns, joined prayers, and maintained humility. But the cameras caught her again and again. Her black dress could not mask the whispers. Some guests looked away. Others whispered behind gloved hands. For many, she represented intrusion. For some, ambition. For Catherine, she was background noise. The Queen Consort's empty chair did more damage than Laura's presence. Official statements repeated, sinusitis. But the tabloids had already framed it differently. Photographs of Camilla at a glittering tea event, smiling with aristocratic wives, fine china between them. She looked healthy, she looked carefree, and she looked absent. This absence was more than medical. It was symbolic, and it gave Catherine the stage without a rival. The first half of the service was devoted to memory. Scripture readings, psalms, and recollections filled the cathedral. A UNICEF colleague of the Duchess spoke of her humanitarian work. A priest read a message from Pope Leo, honoring her devotion to faith and service. The words painted Catherine Worley as she was, quiet, faithful, compassionate. Then Catherine rose. She carried no script in her hand, only the Bible. Her voice was steady as she read from Corinthians, a passage on love, patience, endurance. It was the same verse the Duchess herself had once chosen for a charity reading years before. Every word felt intentional. Every pause echoed. Those in the pews leaned forward. This was not a ceremony. This was succession hidden in Scripture. Catherine closed the book, her hands firm, her eyes fixed on the coffin. She bowed slightly and returned to her seat. It was brief, but it was enough. The connection between her and the Duchess was made visible. Then the moment arrived. At the conclusion of the Eucharist, King Charles stood. The cathedral quieted instantly. The air felt heavy, charged. He adjusted his glasses, then spoke, his voice slow but deliberate. "We gather not only to mourn," he said, "but to honor a wish carried by the Duchess, confirmed by her husband, and embraced by this family." He paused. The silence was almost physical. The responsibilities of the Kent legacy, its patronages, its charitable ties, its household traditions, shall be carried forward. Today, in this cathedral, I confirm that Catherine, Princess of Wales, shall assume these duties. This is the Duchess's final wish. This is the Duke's will. This is our act of continuity. Gasps rippled quietly across the pews. The cameras zoomed. Reporters scribbled. The funeral had shifted. It was no longer just an end. It was a coronation of responsibility. All eyes turned to Catherine. She remained composed. She lowered her gaze in acknowledgement, then rose. The Duke of Kent struggled to his feet, supported by a grandson. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket. From it, he withdrew a brooch, a family heirloom, once worn by the Duchess herself. His hand trembled as he extended it. Catherine stepped forward, steady and reverent. She cupped the brooch in her hands, then bent to kiss the Duke on the cheek. It was a moment of symbolism layered with meaning. A widow handing trust to the future. A king affirming continuity. A princess accepting duty not out of ambition, but necessity. Photographers captured it. The brooch gleamed under cathedral lights. To many, it was no longer jewelry. It was authority made tangible. Catherine curtsied to King Charles, kissed his cheek, and returned to her seat. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her acceptance was complete. Around them, reactions varied. William's face showed pride and solidarity. Prince Edward's eyes glistened with relief. Sarah Ferguson dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Even Prince Andrew, often a shadow in royal gatherings, bowed his head deeper than usual. But where one presence was elevated, another absence screamed louder. Camilla was nowhere. Laura remained seated, her head bowed but her presence disruptive. Analysts would later argue, was Laura sent to mark territory? Was she meant to remind the public of Camilla's lineage? To inject her family into the royal bloodstream? If so, the attempt backfired. In contrast to Catherine's dignity, Laura's role looked misplaced, almost intrusive. And so the funeral became more than farewell. It became a realignment. The Duchess of Kent's legacy flowed not into Camilla, not into outsiders, but directly into Catherine. By Charles's decree and the Duke's gesture, authority shifted openly. The monarchy had chosen its steward for the Kent legacy. As the service ended, the congregation rose. Hymns filled the cathedral once more. Catherine walked ahead, William at her side, the Duke behind them. She carried no crown, no staff, no orb, only a brooch pinned carefully to her coat, a silent emblem of trust. Outside, London's gray skies hung heavy. Bells tolled. Crowds pressed against barriers, their cheers muted by respect. Yet in their faces, one could see recognition. They understood something had changed. The funeral of Catherine Worley was historic not just for its Catholic rites, but for the transfer of power concealed in plain sight. Inside the cathedral, grief had merged with strategy. Tradition had merged with transition. And Catherine, once only the Princess of Wales, now bore a second mantle, custodian of the Kent legacy. The question was not whether she could carry it. The question was how far she would take it. Because this was more than inheritance. This was positioning. This was preparation. This was the monarchy reshaping itself in real time, before a world that watched with sharpened eyes. And as the doors of Westminster Cathedral closed behind her, one fact was clear. Catherine had stepped into a role larger than anyone had expected. A role sealed not by crown, but by trust. The day after the funeral, newspapers across Britain carried the same photograph on their front pages. Catherine, Princess of Wales, bowing her head as the Duke of Kent placed a brooch in her hands. Behind her, King Charles watched. To her side, William stood as silent support. The headline in the Times read, "A Duchess's Wish, a Princess's Burden." The Daily Mail was sharper. Catherine rises as Camilla retreats. Even The Guardian joined in. Legacy of Kent finds new custodian. But not every headline focused on Catherine. Some focused on the missing figure. Where was the Queen? Asked the Telegraph. Sinusitis or strategy? Demanded the Mirror. And the tabloids carried a different image altogether. Camilla at a luxury tea event, her smile wide, her pearls gleaming. The contrast was undeniable. By Monday morning, the narrative was set. The funeral had been more than mourning. It had been a stage for succession. Commentators filled television panels. Former courtiers, journalists, and historians debated what had happened. This was no accident, one royal analyst said on the BBC. The Duchess of Kent's wish was clear. Catherine was chosen. The king respected it. The Duke confirmed it. This was a passing of the torch, carried out in full public view. Another voice on ITV struck harder. Camilla's absence is disastrous optics. Whatever the reason, it has handed Catherine the entire stage. And Laura Lopes' presence only magnified the awkwardness. She is not royal. She has no role. Yet she was there. It looked like maneuvering. Viewers called in, their opinions blunt. Some defended Camilla, citing her health. Others condemned her, accusing her of arrogance and detachment. But nearly all agreed on one point. Catherine had emerged with greater stature. Inside Westminster, the symbolism had been subtle. But outside, in the glare of cameras, it was thunder. For decades, Camilla had been seen as the companion who became consort, the second wife who weathered scandal and found stability beside Charles. She had taken on charities, built networks, and carved a place. But at this funeral, her absence hollowed that place out, and Laura Lopes' appearance filled the void in the most awkward way possible. Laura, an art curator by profession, had rarely courted attention. Yet her sudden presence at a high-profile royal funeral raised eyebrows. Analysts suspected intent. It looked staged, one tabloid editor wrote, as if Camilla wanted to insert her daughter into the royal frame, hinting at status she does not hold. The attempt, if it was one, backfired spectacularly. Against Catherine's poise, Laura's presence looked clumsy. Against Catherine's legitimacy, Laura looked irrelevant. And against Catherine's acceptance of authority, Laura looked misplaced. The image of the brooch transfer, repeated endlessly on television, erased all doubt. The Kent legacy was secure in Catherine's hands. No amount of social maneuvering could change that. Yet beyond the gossip, the implications were serious. For the monarchy, this was not just a funeral. It was a recalibration. The Duke of Kent, at 89, could no longer sustain his duties. The Duchess was gone. Their household, long a quiet but essential branch of the royal tree, needed continuity. By placing Catherine in that role, Charles ensured the Kent legacy did not fade. It was also a way of preparing Catherine for a wider role in the future. This was not about titles. It was about positioning. Catherine now held influence across multiple fronts: the Wales household, her personal causes in mental health and early childhood, and now the Kent patronages. It was a consolidation of trust, built not on bloodline but on merit. And that contrast with Camilla was impossible to miss. Camilla was influenced by marriage. Catherine was earning it through service. Camilla had retreated. Catherine had stepped forward. Royal watchers described the shift as quiet but seismic. Public reaction reflected the same. Social media trended with hashtags: number Princess of Kent in spirit, number where is Camilla, number Catherine rises. Thousands of comments praised Catherine's dignity. Clips of her reading Corinthians circulated widely, hailed as a moment of grace. Yet threads of cynicism ran too. Critics argued the monarchy was dressing up internal politics as solemn duty. This wasn't about honoring the Duchess, one columnist in The Independent wrote. This was about Charles shaping the monarchy's image for the next generation. But even critics acknowledged one fact: Catherine had carried the moment flawlessly. Meanwhile, palace insiders leaked more details. Letters written by the Duchess in her final months reportedly named Catherine directly. They were shown to the Duke, to Charles, and even to William. These letters, aides claimed, were the foundation of the decision. They were not vague, one insider said. The Duchess trusted Catherine. She admired her balance of compassion and discipline. She wanted her legacy preserved by someone who understood duty without arrogance. That framing was powerful. It presented Catherine not as an opportunist, but as the chosen heir of a duchess who valued substance over spectacle. In contrast, Camilla's Tea Party image grew harsher by the day. The idea of her daughter stepping into a funeral only deepened the impression of detachment. Within the palace, whispers spread about the future. Would Catherine take on more beyond the Kent legacy? Would Charles continue to shift symbolic authority toward her? Was this funeral the beginning of a deliberate transition? The answer was not clear, but the direction was. Catherine had been trusted with continuity. She had been handed authority beyond her own household. She had been endorsed by the king, by the duke, and by the legacy of a duchess, admired for her grace. And while Camilla remained queen consort in title, she was absent in image. In the battle for public perception, she had ceded ground. The funeral of the Duchess of Kent was still spoken of as a religious milestone, the first Catholic requiem for a senior royal in modern history. But behind the incense, behind the chants, another milestone had unfolded. The monarchy had shown where its trust lay. In Catherine, not Camilla. In presence, not absence. In service, not spectacle. And as the bells of Westminster faded, it was clear. The balance of influence inside the House of Windsor had shifted. Catherine had stepped into the center, and she was not stepping back. The Duke of Kent had always been described as steady, a soldier, a cousin of the late Queen, a man who carried duty without complaint. At 89, frailty slowed his step, but his presence at the funeral was more than ceremonial. It was decisive. Throughout the service, his eyes remained fixed on Catherine, not on the cameras, not in the congregation, on her. Those who sat nearby later spoke of the moment he pressed the brooch into her hand. His lips moved with words only she could hear. His nod carried more weight than a public speech. It was the nod of a patriarch transferring trust. The Duke knew what it meant. His wife had been the anchor of their household for 6 decades. Together they had guided their children, navigated scandals, and endured grief. Now she is gone. He could not carry it all alone. He chose to let Catherine shoulder what he could not. This was not a power play. It was survival. Family members noticed. Lady Helen Taylor, the Duke's daughter, was seen wiping tears when Catherine accepted the brooch. The Earl of St Andrews looked on with quiet recognition. Even distant cousins, long accustomed to royal formality, seemed to grasp that something permanent had shifted. It was not only about tradition, it was about continuity. The Kent branch had long served as a support beam in the House of Windsor. They represented the crown at independence ceremonies, veterans' commemorations, and cultural events abroad. Their quiet presence had given the monarchy stability. But with age and loss, that branch risked fading. By placing Catherine at its center, the Duke had kept it alive. The broader family reflected a spectrum of reactions. Prince Andrew kept his head down, perhaps relieved that the spotlight shifted elsewhere. Sarah Ferguson whispered prayers, her hands clasped tightly. Prince Michael of Kent, cousin to the Duke, stood ramrod straight, though his gaze lingered on Catherine with something between admiration and relief. William was Catherine's constant anchor. His hand rested lightly at her back as they walked, his expression revealing quiet pride. This was not just his wife rising in status. This was the partner who had shared his burdens, now taking on new ones. Together they looked unshakable. And then there was Laura Lopes. Her presence no longer looked like participation. It looked like an intrusion. As the Duke passed the brooch to Catherine, Laura's seat seemed smaller. The symbolism excluded her entirely. She might have stood in the pews, but she did not stand in the lineage. She did not stand in the trust. Whispers grew louder. She should not have been there, one mourner was overheard saying. This was not her place. The comparison with Catherine could not have been sharper. One embraced by the king and the Duke, the other tolerated at best. It revealed the difference between recognition earned and recognition borrowed. Within palace walls, the implications were discussed in hushed tones. Charles had set a precedent. Duties could be reassigned not just by bloodline, but by merit and trust. It was a quiet shift in the monarchy's DNA. For Camilla, it was a setback. Her absence had left a vacuum. For Laura, it was an exposure. But for Catherine, it was an elevation that no one could question. By the time the family left Westminster Cathedral, the hierarchy felt recalibrated. At the top, Charles remained king. At his side, Camilla remained consort in title, but diminished in perception. Below, William and Catherine emerged not only as heirs but as stewards of continuity. Around them, the extended family reoriented, aware of who carried weight and who did not. The funeral had begun as a farewell. It ended as a signal. The Duke's frailty was obvious. His steps were slow, his shoulders bent, yet his mind remained sharp, his decision deliberate. By passing authority to Catherine, he ensured his branch of the family would not fade into irrelevance. He honored his wife's wish. He entrusted the future. The family watched it happen. The public witnessed it unfold, and history recorded it in photographs that would outlive every whisper. The Duchess of Kent was remembered for her humility, her charity, her resilience. The Duke was remembered for his loyalty, his endurance, his steady hand. Together they had embodied duty without spectacle. By transferring responsibility to Catherine, their legacy would not end in silence. It would continue through someone who mirrored those same values. And as the Duke left the cathedral, supported by his children, the message was clear. His body might weaken, but his judgment remained. Catherine was now the custodian of the Kent legacy, and the monarchy was now, undeniably, hers to shape. The echoes of Westminster Cathedral did not fade when the bells stopped. They traveled into headlines, broadcasts, and living rooms across Britain. The funeral had been framed as farewell. It became confirmation. Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked out of the cathedral with a new weight on her shoulders. Not a crown, not a throne, but the trust of a duchess, the blessing of a duke, and the endorsement of a king. That was power in its purest form. Crowds outside cheered softly, restrained by respect. Yet their eyes followed her. Not Charles, not Edward, not Andrew. Catherine had become the focal point. In the days that followed, tributes to the Duchess of Kent filled newspapers. Her work in classrooms, her service in charities, her dignity through personal loss, all remembered. But alongside those memories, one image dominated: Catherine accepting the brooch. Commentators called it the moment of succession without a throne. Analysts described it as merit replacing protocol. Even critics admitted Catherine had risen above gossip, above optics, above doubt. Camilla's absence remained a wound. Her daughter's presence remained a riddle. But the public's verdict was blunt. Neither mattered anymore. What mattered was Catherine. She had read scripture with calmness. She had comforted children with kindness. She had received authority with grace. She had stood where others faltered. The monarchy had always thrived on symbolism. At this funeral, symbolism became substance. The Kent legacy was safe. The Wales household was stronger, and Catherine's role was no longer a question of when, but a fact of now. September 16th, 2025 began with grief. It ended with a transition, and history will remember it as the day Catherine stopped being just the Princess of Wales. She became the steward of legacy, the bridge of continuity, the heart of a monarchy in search of relevance. Not by decree, not by title, but by trust,